Hello, dear friends. This is John Connor speaking. I'm reporting live from the US military bases used in the War of 1812. That's right, friends, you heard me correctly. The Napoleonic War is remembered and known on that continent as well, only under completely different names. Today, we'll explore the famous forts of New York and Baltimore, discovering star forts across the U.S. We'll uncover their mysterious stories of destruction, concealment, and transformation into memorials. We'll examine what sets star forts apart from military forts and castles, and explore their original purposes. We'll find similarities to forts in St. Petersburg, with megalithic masonry, red brick, and signs of destruction. Why are there so many similarities between Russia and the U.S.? We'll find similarities that are like two peas in a pod, just like our forts in St. Petersburg, with megalithic masonry and red brick. And most importantly, the same signs of their destruction. Exploring the famous forts of New York begins with a boat ride. The same soldiers, people, the colors of the flag, and even the same music in the anthem. My journey today to the famous forts of New York begins with a boat trip. And while the tourist boat covers just 1 kilometer of the upper bay, separating Manhattan from Governor's Island, or to make it easier for you, the island where I can check out 3 out of the 6 forts, which were covered by the Marines, the approaches to New York from the English Armada. I'm deciding to recall all the details I know about those wars. The War of 1812. In June 1812, Napoleon's army invaded Russian territory, while the U.S. declared war on what was then the ally of the Russian Empire, Great Britain. U.S. and Russia linked, Moscow burned, French in, British in Washington, intertwined. After the French troops entered Moscow, it burned down, and the British Expeditionary Force took Washington, and burned down the central part of the city, where the government buildings were located. Both the French and the British abandoned these cities without a fight after the fires, as if their main tactical task had already been accomplished. Don't you think that's strange, friends? Both in Russia and in the United States, the War of 1812 was long considered a significant event that seriously impacted the trajectories of both nations. Russia established itself as a shaper of Europe's fate, while the U.S. began its westward expansion. Moreover, after the war, both the White House and the national anthem emerged in the United States. The stars, shining on the banner, which sings of land of the free, home of the brave, like 2 drops of water. Similar to the songs of Cazabulat Udaloy, officially written after the creation of the American anthem. But, how they twist history with dates, I don't need to tell you. So, who was first here doesn't really matter. It's important to note that even in the music of the War of 1812 across different continents, we again find magical coincidences. The reasons for the conflict involving the United States. By that time, they had only been independent states for 20 years, and as former colonies of the British Empire. That seemed like a lot. Only a part of them had anything to do with the events happening in Europe. Back then, Americans had a very negative view of Britain, while the British looked down on their former fellow citizens who had turned against the king. Britain was involved in global military campaigns, the Napoleonic Wars, and they didn't take the new nation seriously. Britain, engaged in a series of military campaigns around the world, the Napoleonic Wars, was trying to block France's foreign trade. Napoleon was doing the same to England. She was trying to block France's foreign trade. Napoleon was pursuing a similar policy against England. This is exactly the reason that officials cite as the main one for the start of the war with Russia. The United States became a victim of this policy, which at the time officially maintained neutrality. The conflict escalated after British ships started inspecting American trading vessels and forcibly arresting American sailors born in Britain, who, in the opinion of the English, remained subjects of His Majesty in order to include them in the composition of their crews. Of course, British agents operating from Canadian territory were financially and militarily supporting the Indian tribes united in a confederation led by Chief Tecumseh, who were attacking American settlers. Some of the American establishment also hoped to annex British Canada to the U.S., a significant portion of whose population consisted of refugees from the United States who remained loyal to the British Crown. Ironically, communication issues led to the war being declared only after London decided to lift the ban on U.S. trade with France, who remained loyal to the British Crown. Ironically, communication issues led to the war being declared only after London decided to lift the ban on U.S. trade with France. So, the poorly prepared and small American troops and militia attacked British Canada. This happened at a time when the main reason for for the military escalation between the countries had already been resolved. They attacked British Canada at the time when the main reason for the military escalation between the countries had already been resolved. Historians describe this event as follows. A ship from Europe sailed to America with news of the naval blockade's end, while another vessel went back with the U.S. notice of war against Britain. It's unclear why the young nation entered a conflict with a superpower. And it's still unclear how and why a young, fledgling nation with an unprepared military force got itself into a conflict with a superpower of that time. Not Britain, whose main forces were occupied in Europe. Not the U.S. with a small and poorly equipped army and navy, de facto. This war was unnecessary, but despite all the orthodox aspects of the situation, it began. The poorly prepared attacks by American troops and militias on Canada were repelled. But, despite all the orthodoxy of the situation, it began. Poorly prepared attacks by American troops and militia on Canada were repulsed. Moreover, the British, with the support of Tecumseh's warriors, captured American Detroit, which was also selectively subjected to destruction. The largest state and municipal buildings, as well as the private and residential sectors, were burned. They were not harmed. And again, friends, I get this feeling of déjà vu with the thought that they weren't fighting for victory or any kind of result, but rather to create a reason to destroy certain objects and structures. The turning point in the campaign in this direction came after the Americans built a fleet of warships that established control over the Great Lakes, cutting off the British Army from its bases. In 1814, Napoleon was defeated. Thanks to this, the British Empire was able to focus on the war with the U.S. The British transferred most of their fleet and army to North America and established a blockade of the U.S. Atlantic coast. They attacked New York, Baltimore, New Orleans, and took Washington without much trouble. In fact, President James Madison and his wife fled the city at the very last moment, miraculously avoiding capture. The British burned down the presidential palace. After the war, by the way, it was restored and whitewashed to hide the traces of fire. That's when it started being called the White House. The Capitol and several other government buildings were also destroyed. As they left Washington, again without a fight, the British took several hostages. To free them, a group of negotiators was sent, among whom was the famous lawyer Francis Scott Key. Key and his companions arrived on board the flagship of the British squadron, which was cruising near Baltimore. The British held the negotiators until the operation to capture the city was complete. From the deck of the frigate, Key watched as the English squadron bombarded Fort McHenry, which was defending the approaches to Baltimore Harbor. The garrison of the fort heroically resisted. Inspired by what he saw, Key wrote a poem that was published in American newspapers, noting that the poem, Attention, could be sung to the tune of a popular melody. In 1916, the President, Woodrow Wilson, ordered that this song be performed at military parades, and in 1931, Francis Scott Key's creation officially became the national anthem of the United States. The stars, shining on the banner. To be continued. Subtitles, made by Dimiterzak.
We were in the north, at a bunch of palaces, flippers. Has it been there? Poor shack. Yours.
The last major battle of this confusing war. The Battle of New Orleans. It took place after American and British diplomats signed the peace treaty in Ghent, now Belgium. The American militia pushed the British landing back from the city. The war ended in a draw. The peace treaty legally consolidated the previously existing borders and principles of relations. But the Americans were able to tackle one more big problem for themselves. During these years, the last powerful alliances of Indian tribes, which theoretically could have resisted the expansion of the United States, were defeated. The European powers that had colonies in America no longer tried to hinder this expansion. Eventually, all these steps led to the sale of Alaska by the Russian Empire for a laughable $7,200,000. About 2,500 Russians and around 60,000 Native Americans and Eskimos lost the protection of the Russian crown for an amount that wouldn't even be enough to build a building for the New York District Court. Write in the comments, friends, what do you think this was done for? And I'll sum it up. This is a war that nobody needed. It only addressed such issues: selective destruction of a number of objects on U.S. territory, a global cleansing among the indigenous population of America, and nothing more. And now, friends, let's return to the beautiful tale of the poem that inspired the creation of the U.S. national anthem. Lawyer Francis Scott Key wrote it after being inspired by the sight of the battle between the English fleet and the American star, Fort McHenry. Some details of this fight. The English ships positioned in a circle. They unleashed artillery fire. The battle lasted 2 days. Low on ammunition, the British retreated. This dance under the cannonade lasted almost 2 days. After exhausting nearly all their ammunition, the British retreated, unable to land troops in Baltimore. The American flag flew over Fort McHenry. Supporters of the official history might say, but look, one star fort successfully repelled the attack of an entire fleet. Here you have proof that this is a 100% fortification structure. And it's quite effective rather than the structures of ancient civilizations adapted for military purposes. But let's not rush. Let us now compare similar forts. New York, which had never taken part in a battle, with the legendary Fort McHenry, which had undergone a 2-day baptism of fire.
See these holes? Assume this is the fort, and it's intentionally buried. One could assume that they dug all the way down, and this part is actually buried underground. A hill hides the fort. Rooms may be below, and everything that's right beneath us, theoretically, could be rooms.
Official history claims that at the beginning of the 19th century, on the eve of the war with England, many coastal fortifications were built in the USA, having spent on this task generally between 2 and 4 years. That's cool. There's no regular army, just militia and volunteers, and the Navy is small. They built many coastal fortifications. In New York Harbor, there were a dozen forts. Manhattan had 6. 1 was in Manhattan, 1 on Bedloes Island, now Liberty Island, 1 on Ellis Island, and 3 on Governor's Island. This network could cover the harbor with crossfire, protecting each other and preventing enemy landings. 5 of the 6 forts survive today, covering each other and denying the enemy any chance to approach the city from the sea and attempt a landing. 5 out of the 6 have survived to this day, though in different forms. The English didn't even try to land in New York. They had enough with Baltimore, but the forts remained. They carried out postal service even during the Civil War, and they were also used in a variety of roles, from the prison to the aquarium.
Clinton Castle. Clinton Castle. It really looks like a star fortress. Friends who sell tickets to the Statue of Liberty here many times. Can you imagine? Wow, this fort burned down and is just chilling now. Well, it's like the American version.
In Manhattan itself, there was the Western Battery, later renamed Clinton Castle. Why it's called a castle, I don't know. Maybe you have some theories, drop them in the comments. After that, it served as a customs and immigration office. The fort is shaped like a truncated circle. The horseshoe-shaped part faces the sea, while the back is closed off in a straight line. The main armament of these bastions was a 28-pound cannon from the early 19th century. The carriage, of course, is modern, and here you can see the cannon barrel through the embrasure. Apparently, they were shooting blindly at the gunner. It's just impossible terrain. Fort Gibson on Ellis Island hasn't survived. That's what the officials say. But I noticed 2 surviving beams. Here they are. I'll also leave the coordinates in the description. And a little deeper into the center of the island, in the shade of the trees, next to the metal plates, with lists of the first immigrants, left like an open-air museum. Here's an interesting artifact sticking out of the ground, accompanied by the inscription in white on red. Fort Gibson, the New York defensive system. So, you say it hasn't survived. So what is this then? covered with cement on top and filled with soil and pebbles, with large red bricks sticking out straight from under the ground. Without any hint of a foundation, here they are, the remnants of the star of Ellis Island. Right here, on Ellis Island, by the way, is where that famous scene from the movie Hitch was filmed. Remember, Eva Mendes putting ice on the bump on her forehead after Will Smith hit her. And then they walked around the museum. If you can, rewatch that scene one more time. Noticing the ceiling and the floor, there's exactly the same kind of masonry that I encountered while walking in Brooklyn Park. Fort Wood had even less luck. The fort's appearance is ruined, but the view is stunning. It remains but as a pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. The whole look of the fort has been ruined, but the view from above the fort is stunning. It was a staffic, meaning it was shaped like a star with 11 points. The reasoning for a coastal battery shielded by artillery like my buddies is unclear. How do you position batteries along a jagged line without crews interfering or accidentally firing on each other at the battle start? Remember, this is war. The black powder era creates so much smoke that after a neighbor's cannon fires, visibility is poor. My crew can only wait for the smoke to clear to aim accurately. Historians say the main goal of such a setup is to prevent enemy assaults by providing crossfire. My crew can just sit back and smoke while waiting for the fog to clear so we can make any kind of accurate shot. After all, the main purpose of such a structure, as historians claim, is to prevent the enemy from storming the walls by providing crossfire. Gunfire, the infantry, is storming the walls, and this is the island. The ship with the landing troops still needs to get closer to it. But this is not a large ship, nor small boats will be able to do this, since the unified system of forts in the bay will quickly turn them into food for the fish. It is here, on an island surrounded on all sides by water and covered from other parts of the land, that the whole absurdity of building a star fortress, as in ratification, becomes obvious. It's just not needed here. But for some reason, someone still went ahead and built it, so there were other goals and objectives.
To be continued. Look. Right. Here are the actual remnants of what used to be a big fort. Well, pop into them, like that. But on Governor's Island, out of the 3 fortifications, 2 are really well preserved. The South Battery has been built over so much that it's hard to recognize it as a fortification. The Southern Battery is built like this. It is not easy to recognize a fortification structure in it. But Forts J and Williams are in great shape. It seems like Fort J. In the past, Columbus was a typical star fort with 4 bastions, and a ravelin surrounded by a moat with an outer rampart. It was originally armed with 60 heavy cannons, each with a caliber of over 32 pounds. The side of the rampart. It almost hides the fort, securely protecting the base of the walls. And this is a view of the bastions of the fort from the side, from the inner side of the rampart. The shooting carpet of Tway. The question of its necessity comes up again, since landing troops and storming the bastion on land is practically impossible. The front bastions with a bridge over the moat leading to the entrance. In the past, the bridge had a drawbridge section. From the inner courtyard, an artillery slope leads to the bastions. The gun on the walls is a 10-inch smoothbore Rodman Columbiad mounted on a fortified carriage, model 1861. The elevation angle of the gun was adjusted with a crowbar and a few sharp words. Ah, how the gunners back then could have used some good Russian swear words. It would have been faster and more informative. And this is the ravelin with the neck. It would have been faster and more informative. And this is the ravelin with the neck. On the ravelin, there are 3 more Rodman guns. 2 10-inch guns on the sides and a 15-inch gun in the center. Just about 100 meters from the fort. J. Williams, who for some reason is called KSL, which means castle. This is what it looks like from the water. At the beginning, the fort was armed with about 90 heavy cannons with calibers of 32, 42, 50, and 52 pounds. The layout of the guns is casemate style in 3 tiers, plus a roof. Each tier has 13 casemates, with 2 guns in each one. The walls are only 2.5 meters thick. It's not as much as it seems, since the fort is built from limestone. Yes, this material is easy to work with, it doesn't weigh much, but it also breaks down much more easily. Fort's embrasures, largest bottom/roof. The largest caliber was located below, as well as on the roof. Since the Civil War, the fort has been used as a military prison, so everything is locked up with bars. What's interesting is, what about its defensive functions? He wasn't deprived. The captured Confederates were kept in casemates along with the guns, which is actually nonsense. During any prison riot, the inmates can quickly turn the prison into a fortress with heavy artillery. Look, you can still see the cannon on the roof in this photo. So how did this happen? Let's try to figure it out. The corridors are very narrow. There are no slopes like in Fort J here. Access is only by stairs. How did these parasites get the cannons, materials, and so on into the casemates? I can only assume that there were some temporary wooden ramps from the courtyard to each floor, after which they were taken apart. Then it makes sense why they didn't remove the cannons from the fort that was turned into a prison. They just couldn't. The only way to the roof is through one of the two round towers, up a narrow spiral staircase. Rodman fires 3 miles with 434-pound projectiles. Here it is, the 15-inch Rodman. This beast could fire 3 miles with projectiles weighing 434 pounds, which is almost 200 kilograms. And they brought the ammunition up this spiral staircase where they could barely turn around. Williams is horseshoe-shaped, facing water, straight walls meet. From the edges of the horseshoe, straight walls extend, meeting at a right angle. At the junction of the walls, there's a watchtower, a barbican, the only defensive element, facing the island. That makes sense. From the rear, Williams is protected by Fort J, no other defense is needed. And then, it hit me, friends. Fortresses are what were really built for war in the early 19th century. It's quite understandable and logical for our perception of fortress architecture. Thick walls with several floors of artillery embrasures spread out across firing sectors. Up top, there's a large caliber on rotating carriages. A classic. And the best part is, it has all been preserved in excellent condition up to our time. Ready to fight as soon as tomorrow. But what about the stars? And here's a sad picture. Liberty Island has been turned into a pedestal for the statue. Ellis Island, you can see the remnants of 2 beams, and a bit of old brickwork has survived. The building of the Migration Museum was built right on the star. Governor's Island has the 4J star left, but really, what's storming on an island? And this gives officials a chance to insist on the version of fortification with protection from assault. But what an assault on the island, oh my! And the neighboring Fort Williams doesn't have that kind of defense line either. And that just proves that the idea of needing fortification in this form is really a stretch, as the most suitable for this type of structure. The southern battery didn't get lucky. This star was too close to the water. Summary. In the end, only one visible beam remains, on top of which they've built some kind of house. Just another example of basic logic, friends. Another example of basic logic, friends. You are digging a hole on your property, located on the bank of a picturesque river. You end up with some extra soil on top, and being a sensible person, you use it to reinforce the nearest riverbank instead of loading it onto a boat. And you paddle across the river to do the same on the other side. Americans lost logic. During subway construction in New York, moved soil to Governor's Island, tripling its area. And they moved all that soil without feeling tired. They transported it to Governor's Island, increasing its original area by 3 times. What the hell? Sorry for my French, but now we're diving into pure conspiracy theory. It seems to me that they didn't pull off such a laborious feat for no reason, knowing that a few meters of water wouldn't be enough in the future. I feel like they didn't pull off such a laborious feat for no reason, knowing that a few meters of water wouldn't be enough in the future to hide something. Realizing that a few meters of water wouldn't be enough in the future to hide something. Something from prying eyes. To hide something. Something from prying eyes. But hundreds of tons of empty rock would do a better job with that task. Now, let's get back to the question I raised at the beginning of the film. Let's compare the forts. New Yorkers who have never once participated in battles with the legendary fort that went through a 2-day combat baptism. Fort McHenry. Let's take Fort J, which is the most similar to it. It's got 4 points on the main line, plus 1 extra bastion. And McHenry has 5 beams, 1 additional bastion. What do we see? the main part of the artillery battery at the Baltimore fort, which held off the English armada, preventing them from entering the bay, is behind the outer brick wall of the star-shaped structure. It's shielded from enemy fire by a simple earthen rampart with no extra protection against assault troops. To boost firepower, extra cannons are lined up straight. They're in the typical layout of redoubts from that time. The second line of defense is supposedly on the fortress walls, but there's only one cannon, while 4 rotating platforms are empty. Deployment in the typical layout of redoubts from that time. Yeah, the second line of defense is supposedly on the walls of the fortress, but on this point, there's only one cannon and the 4 rotating platforms are empty. The situation isn't any better at other positions. Why? The answer is simple. The lower the position to the earth line, the less vulnerable it is. At Fort McHenry, Americans weren't too concerned. Minimal land assaults led to adapting the star-shaped structure, moving artillery to the front. Attempts to storm the fortress by land, therefore, they adapted the star structure as conveniently as possible from the point of view of military tactics of that time, moving artillery to the front positions. So, the official argument for the need to build fortifications of this type due to military technology just doesn't hold up. They were tailored for these purposes, and very skillfully, as proven by the battle in Baltimore Harbor. Again, it remains an open question. It was adapted for these purposes, and very skillfully, as proven by the battle in Baltimore Harbor. Again, it remains an open question, the question of the proportionality of the efforts and resources expended. If one fort in Baltimore was enough to prevent an assault from the water, why create such firepower from 6 major forts in New York? I think you are convinced of the reinforced concrete strength of the city's defense from the water by the network of bastions in Upper Bay. The British didn't even dare to come close. They got intel from their spies and tried to take the city by siege from land. But no, it turns out the city's residents didn't stop there. They built 2 more fortifications, just in case. Here you can see what they look like.
It's just all buried under dirt here. Where did you go off to? Alicia, where have you been? What were you wearing? Alicia, I was down there. What were you doing over there? I was filming. Hey, if they didn't take it, what's up with the cement mix? And stones? Why? Were they trying to fill it in? And top below the bushes. And here it was funny that here, too, I understand, there was a ceiling. And there was something else above. That is, where are we standing? It is clear that they were biting into it. It seems they were breaking it all apart for some reason. All of this is apparently part of the walls. How interesting. At that time, the guys were processing this stone, cutting it out and lifting it, transporting it, using their hands or something. Over there, we can see a brick roof, brick masonry, but you can't really see anything here. The floor is unclear, whether it's modern or not. And there's some kind of metal insert here. What is that? When you say it, how much is it? When will you be ready to take a picture of what kind of room this is with a stone roof? And for some reason, we have a closed staircase going up to the 3rd floor. Then in this room, what we see here is diagonal manual work, arch masonry, and here's arch masonry. Ready to take a picture of what kind of room this is, which appears to be quite mysterious and intriguing, with a stone roof. That gives it an ancient and historical feel. And for some reason, there's a closed staircase going up to the 3rd floor, which adds to the enigma of the place. Then in this room, what we see here is diagonal manual work, arch masonry. And here's arch masonry. The brick looks like it's the same one. What's here? What's here? Why? Why? There's some kind of passage over there. Here we have an arched ceiling. And here's the ground. So there's an interesting room over there. Let's be careful and climb up slowly. On the remnants of the old fort, we can see round holes, but we can't see anything here either.
Thank you, friends, for the very interesting and useful footage of that place that I, unfortunately, didn't get a chance to visit. By the way, I'm reaching out to all the viewers of my channel. If you have anything interesting about America and beyond, send it to me via email. Links and contacts are in the description. Americans built forts, adapted stars, so why not a military outpost? Logical use of tech and military capabilities then. Even different fort names, like castle or fort, make sense. It's a pretty logical use of the technological and military capabilities of that time. Even the different names of the fortifications, in one case a castle and in another a fort, start to make some sense. But let me share one more observation about Fort McHenry. In memory of the battle in Baltimore Harbor near the fort, a monument has been erected to the defenders of the city. He's all set in the military uniform of the American Army from that period. And this is the monument to Francis Scott Key. Remember, the author of the national anthem and a witness to the battle, a respected citizen of the city and a lawyer. First of all, the sheer size of it is striking compared to the modest monument to the defenders of the fort. Secondly, a naked lawyer in the image of Orpheus with a lyre and a fig leaf. That's definitely over the top. Thirdly, the relief on the pedestal shows naked joyful people with musical instruments, which emphasizes the ancient character of the entire monument. But in this photo, it may look bad, but still the text of the dedication, to the author, and his bas-relief can be read. But pay attention to the gaps where the scale of the bas-relief does not match the other figures. I personally have a strong feeling that this fragment was added in later. Looks great. They're passing off a complex ancient hero with a lyre in Roman sandals as someone he clearly wasn't before. And now, friends, before we continue our conversation about monuments and sculptures, after visiting Liberty Island and looking at one of the symbols of the United States, the Statue of Liberty, from various angles, there's another, little-known, hard-to-reach spot at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor, just a little over 7 kilometers from Fort McHenry. Across the water's surface, you can find the abandoned Fort Carroll, which is a 100% man-made island shaped perfectly. A hexagon. Why is there practically nothing known about him? Yeah, because supposedly it didn't even exist by the time of the War of 1812. They never finished building it by the time of the Civil War in 1861. And by the Spanish-American War in 1898, it was already morally outdated. Although from a strategic point of view, its construction wasn't even necessary by the time of the War of 1812. Since the width of the watershed here is less than 3 kilometers. So that means, even the artillery of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century could easily lob cannonballs from shore to shore. The logic of my thoughts is confirmed by the fact that such an artillery position was later set up at one of the nearby capes, Fort Amsterdam. So, what was this built for? By the way, if the decision had been made to install the Statue of Liberty in Baltimore, you just can't find a better spot with a ready-made pedestal